Officer Tom Reynolds had been patrolling the quiet suburban highways for over a decade. Each day blended into the next, filled with routine stops and the occasional high-speed chase. His job had become second nature, a series of motions performed with mechanical precision. Today seemed no different as he drove along the familiar stretch of road, his eyes scanning for any signs of trouble. He was known among his peers for his strict enforcement of traffic laws and his unwavering commitment to the badge. But beneath the surface, there was something more. An ingrained suspicion, shaped by years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the highway as Reynolds spotted a sleek black sedan in the distance. The car caught his attention immediately, not because it was speeding significantly, but because it was just over the limit. The tinted windows, which made it impossible to see who was inside, only heightened his curiosity. Reynolds had seen this before. Expensive cars driven by people who believed they were untouchable, flaunting the law without care. In his experience, such vehicles often belonged to individuals who thought they were above the rules, and that irked him. Without a second thought, Reynolds activated his lights and siren, signaling the car to pull over. The sedan smoothly veered to the side of the road, coming to a halt under the shade of a large oak tree. As Reynolds approached the vehicle, he ran through the usual checklist in his mind. Check for weapons, observe the driver's demeanor, and be prepared for anything. His hand instinctively rested on his holster, a gesture of both authority and caution. He could feel his pulse quicken, the familiar rush of adrenaline that accompanied every traffic stop, especially when something felt off. The driver's side window rolled down, revealing a young black man in military uniform. The crisp lines of the uniform, the medals pinned to the chest, and the calm, steady gaze of the man seated inside took Reynolds by surprise. He hadn't expected this. The man's posture was impeccable, his expression neutral, yet confident. "Good afternoon, officer," the man greeted, his voice deep and controlled, devoid of any hostility. Reynolds blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. This wasn't the scenario he had imagined. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other, Reynolds, the seasoned cop, and the young soldier, each assessing the other. The silence was thick with unspoken words, a battle of wills fought in the span of a few seconds. Reynolds felt his usual script, stern questions, authoritative demands, slip away from him. There was something about the soldier's presence that made it difficult to fall back on the habits he had honed over years of policing. The uniform, the insignia, the way the man carried himself. It all spoke of discipline, service, and a quiet strength that Reynolds couldn't easily dismiss. Yet despite the soldier's composed demeanor, Reynolds couldn't shake the sense of suspicion that had been ingrained in him over years of service. The car, the tinted windows, the fact that this man, despite his uniform, was a stranger on his turf. All of it fed into the biases he had carried with him for so long. He cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice firmer than he intended. The soldier nodded, reaching slowly into the glove compartment with deliberate, non-threatening movements. As he handed over the documents, Reynolds noticed the name on the license, Staff Sergeant David Carter. The name, coupled with the uniform, stirred something in Reynolds. He had always respected the military, admired the men and women who served, but this encounter was different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that this wasn't just another routine traffic stop. Reynolds felt a flicker of doubt, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let his guard down, no matter who was sitting in that car. Staff Sergeant Carter remained calm, his hands resting on the steering wheel as Reynolds reviewed the documents. His face was a mask of composure, but there was a subtle tension in his posture, a readiness for whatever might come next. Carter had been in situations like this before, moments where his race put him at a disadvantage, despite the uniform he wore. He knew the drill. Stay calm, be respectful, and hope that the situation didn't escalate. But beneath the calm exterior, there was a quiet resolve. He wouldn't allow himself to be intimidated. Not here, not now. As Reynolds stood there, holding Carter's documents, he felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was no ordinary traffic stop. The man in front of him had served his country, faced dangers far greater than a speeding ticket, And yet here he was, being questioned by a cop on a routine patrol. The irony wasn't lost on Reynolds, and for the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning his own actions. He looked at Carter, the soldier's calm, unwavering gaze meeting his own, and felt a pang of uncertainty. What was he really doing here? Reynolds took a step back, the weight of the documents in his hands suddenly feeling heavier. He wasn't dealing with just any driver. This was a man who had been on the front lines, who had seen things that Reynolds couldn't even begin to imagine. The insignia on Carter's uniform indicated he was no ordinary soldier. He was a decorated staff sergeant, someone who had earned respect through service and sacrifice. For a moment, Reynolds felt a flicker of guilt for the way he had approached the situation, but his training, his instincts, and years of ingrained bias kept him on edge. Staff Sergeant David Carter sat quietly, watching the officer with the patience of someone who had been through far worse. His eyes never left Reynolds, studying him as carefully as the officer was studying him. Carter knew what was happening. He had been here before, pulled over for no reason other than the color of his skin. The uniform might have changed the officer's approach, but it hadn't erased the underlying suspicion. Carter could feel it in the way Reynolds hesitated, the way he scrutinized the documents as if looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. Reynolds felt the tension building, a knot of unease tightening in his chest. This wasn't how traffic stops usually went for him. He was used to being in control, to issuing commands and having them followed without question. But something about this situation, about Carter, threw him off balance. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but the usual certainty he carried with him during these encounters was slipping away. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure, but the words that came out felt forced. "What's your destination, Sergeant?" he asked, his tone more brusque than he intended. Carter didn't flinch. "I'm heading home, sir. Just finished a week of training at Fort Benning." His response was clear, concise, but there was a slight edge to his voice, a quiet reminder that he was not just any citizen, but a soldier who had earned his place. Reynolds noted the subtle emphasis on "sir," a formality that carried weight, especially coming from someone in uniform. There was no defiance in Carter's tone, but there was something else, a strength, a resolve that told Reynolds this man wouldn't be easily intimidated. The words hung in the air, the silence between them growing thicker with each passing second. Reynolds felt the pressure mounting. This was supposed to be routine, just another stop on a long shift, but it was quickly turning into something far more complicated. He could feel Carter's eyes on him, steady and unwavering, and it unnerved him. Reynolds was used to seeing fear, frustration, or anger in the eyes of those he pulled over, but not this calm, controlled confidence. It made him question himself, question why he had pulled Carter over in the first place. As the silence stretched on, Carter decided to take the initiative. "Is there a problem, Officer Reynolds?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of firmness. It wasn't a challenge, but it wasn't a passive inquiry either. It was a question that demanded an honest answer. Carter wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't going to let himself be treated unfairly either. He had faced far worse than this on the battlefield, and he wasn't about to let a routine traffic stop shake him. Reynolds felt a surge of defensiveness rise within him, but it was quickly followed by a wave of doubt. What was he doing? The soldier in front of him had done nothing wrong, and yet here he was, treating him with the same suspicion he reserved for those who truly posed a threat. It was a sobering realization, one that made him feel uncomfortable in his own skin. He had always prided himself on being a good cop, on serving his community with integrity, but in this moment, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing in that duty. Carter watched the internal struggle play out on Reynolds' face, his expression remaining neutral. He knew the officer was wrestling with something, whether it was his own biases, his authority, or simply the unexpected nature of the encounter. Carter couldn't say, but he recognized the signs. He had seen it before, in other officers, in civilians, even in some of his fellow soldiers. It was the moment when someone realized they were confronting something within themselves that they hadn't fully acknowledged before. Carter remained silent, giving Reynolds the space to work through it. Finally, Reynolds spoke, his voice quieter, almost resigned. "No, Sergeant, there's no problem. I just needed to be sure." The words felt hollow even as he said them. He knew they didn't fully capture what was happening inside him, but it was the best he could offer in the moment. He handed the documents back to Carter, feeling the weight of his own actions more heavily than before. This man had done nothing wrong, yet he had been subjected to scrutiny simply because of who he was and the assumptions Reynolds had made. Carter took the documents, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a softening perhaps, or a quiet acknowledgement of the officer's struggle. "Thank you, officer," he said simply, his voice steady. There was no bitterness, no anger, just a straightforward response that carried with it an understanding of the complexities at play. Carter knew that change didn't happen overnight, but he also knew that this interaction, however small, was a step in the right direction. And for now, that was enough. As Reynolds stepped back from the car, he found himself lingering, unable to walk away just yet. The interaction with Carter had stirred something in him, something he couldn't quite name. He felt compelled to know more about the man behind the uniform, the person who had managed to unsettle him in ways he hadn't anticipated. "You've seen some action, haven't you?" Reynolds asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. It was a clumsy attempt at connection, but it was the best he could manage under the circumstances. Carter looked at him, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Yes, sir," he replied, his tone respectful but not deferential. "3 tours in Afghanistan. I've seen my fair share." There was a pause, the weight of his words settling between them. Carter didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The silence was enough to convey the experiences that lay behind those simple words. Reynolds nodded, feeling the distance between them narrow slightly. He wasn't sure what had prompted him to ask, but something about Carter's demeanor had sparked a curiosity in him. "I've never served," Reynolds admitted, almost sheepishly, "but I've got a nephew in the Marines. I know it's not easy." The words felt inadequate, a small offering in the face of what Carter had likely endured. But it was all Reynolds had to give. He wasn't used to feeling out of his depth, but the more he talked to Carter, the more he realized how much he didn't know about the military, about the experiences of those who served, and about the prejudices he had carried with him for so long. Carter appreciated the gesture, recognizing it as an attempt to connect, however awkward it might be. "It's not," he agreed, "but it's worth it. Serving this country, protecting the people back home, that's what keeps you going." There was a sincerity in his voice that Reynolds couldn't ignore. Carter spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had faced the worst the world had to offer and come out the other side with his principles intact. It was a reminder to Reynolds of the responsibility he carried as a police officer, a responsibility that went beyond enforcing the law. The two men stood there for a moment, the conversation lulling as they took in each other's words. There was a mutual respect growing between them, an understanding that hadn't been there at the start of the encounter. Reynolds felt a strange sense of relief, as if a burden he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted. He had approached this situation with suspicion, but he was leaving it with something closer to admiration. It wasn't something he had expected, but it was a welcome change. For Carter, the interaction was a reminder of the complexities of life back home. He had faced countless dangers overseas, but the challenges of navigating the biases and assumptions of his fellow citizens were just as real. He knew that this encounter could have gone differently, that it could have ended in frustration or worse, but it hadn't, and for that, he was grateful. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Every interaction like this, where understanding prevailed over prejudice, was a step toward a better future. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm glow over the highway, Reynolds finally broke the silence. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," he said, his tone sincere. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything they had shared in the past few minutes. Carter nodded in acknowledgement, his eyes meeting Reynolds's with a look that conveyed mutual respect. There was no need for further words. They both understood what had transpired between them. Reynolds took a step back, giving Carter space to drive away, but he didn't return to his patrol car immediately. He watched as the black sedan pulled back onto the road, its taillights fading into the distance. The encounter had left him with a lot to think about his role as an officer, about the assumptions he made, and about the people he encountered in his daily life. He knew that this moment would stay with him, shaping the way he approached his job in the future. Carter drove away with a sense of quiet satisfaction. He knew that this encounter, while challenging, had been important. It had been a chance to break down barriers, to show that respect and understanding could prevail even in difficult situations. As he continued down the highway, heading home after a long week, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His service didn't end with his uniform. It extended into every interaction, every opportunity to make the world a better place. As Reynolds returned to his patrol car, he couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had just occurred. The interaction with Staff Sergeant Carter had started like any other traffic stop, but it had evolved into something far more meaningful. Reynolds had spent years on the force, priding himself on his ability to read people, to assess situations with a quick, sharp eye. But Carter had defied his expectations, forcing Reynolds to confront biases he hadn't even realized he held. Sitting in his car, Reynolds stared at the dashboard, his mind racing. He had approached Carter with suspicion, assuming that the sleek black sedan and the tinted windows were signs of something amiss. It was a mindset that had served him well in the past, allowing him to uncover crimes and prevent wrongdoing, but today it had led him down the wrong path. The realization was unsettling, shaking the foundation of the instincts he had relied on for so long. Reynolds thought back to the moment he had seen the military insignia on Carter's uniform. It had been a jolt to his system, a reminder that not everyone fit the narrow categories he had unconsciously created in his mind. Carter was a soldier, a man who had served his country with honor. Yet Reynolds had initially seen him as just another potential threat. The thought made him uncomfortable, but he knew it was important to confront these feelings, to understand where they came from. As the sun continued its descent, casting long shadows across the highway, Reynolds reflected on his years as a police officer. He had always believed he was doing the right thing, that his actions were justified in the name of law and order. But the encounter with Carter had exposed a flaw in his thinking, one that he couldn't ignore. He had let his assumptions guide him, rather than the facts in front of him. It was a humbling realization, one that left him questioning how many other times he might have done the same without even realizing it. Reynolds knew that being a good cop meant more than just enforcing the law. It meant serving the community with fairness and integrity, treating every individual with respect, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. Today he had fallen short of that standard, and it gnawed at him. He wondered how many other officers had experienced similar moments of doubt, questioning the assumptions that had become second nature in their line of work. It wasn't an easy thing to do, but Reynolds knew it was necessary. The image of Carter's calm, unwavering gaze lingered in Reynolds' mind. The soldier had handled the situation with a grace and dignity that Reynolds admired. Carter hadn't lashed out or shown anger, even when it was clear he had every reason to. Instead, he had engaged in a conversation, offering Reynolds a glimpse into his life, his experiences, and the values he held dear. It was a lesson in humility, one that Reynolds knew he needed to carry with him moving forward. Reynolds' thoughts turned to his own life, his own values. He had joined the police force with the intention of protecting and serving his community, of making a positive difference in the world. But over the years, that mission had become clouded by the realities of the job, by the fear, the danger, and the pressure to make split-second decisions. Somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of the importance of treating each person as an individual, rather than a potential threat. The encounter with Carter had been a wake-up call, reminding him of the values that had initially driven him to wear the badge. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Reynolds made a silent promise to himself. He would do better. He would take the lessons learned from this encounter and apply them to every interaction he had moving forward. He would strive to see beyond the surface, to understand the people he encountered on a deeper level, and to challenge the biases that had been ingrained in him over the years. It wouldn't be easy, but he knew it was the right thing to do. Reynolds finally started the engine, the familiar hum of the patrol car grounding him in the present. He pulled back onto the highway, the road stretching out before him, illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. As he drove, he felt a sense of determination settle over him. The encounter with Carter had been a turning point, a moment of clarity in an otherwise routine day. Reynolds knew that this wasn't the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would strive to be the officer he had always aspired to be. Reynolds continued down the highway, the patrol car's headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The events of the past hour played on a loop in his mind, the conversation with Staff Sergeant Carter replaying with every mile. There was something about the way Carter had carried himself, the quiet confidence in his voice, that had left a lasting impression on Reynolds. It was a confidence born not of arrogance, but of experience, of having faced challenges far greater than a routine traffic stop. As Reynolds drove, he found himself wanting to know more about Carter's story. What had he seen in those tours overseas? What had he endured that had shaped him into the man he was today? There were so many questions left unanswered, and Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed an opportunity to learn something important. The conversation had been brief, but it had opened a door to a world that Reynolds knew little about, a world of sacrifice, of honor, and of service. The more Reynolds thought about it, the more he realized how much he had to learn. He had spent years in his own bubble, focused on the challenges of policing, but Carter's presence had reminded him that there were others who faced dangers just as great, if not greater. Soldiers like Carter risked their lives every day, often in far-off lands, all to protect the freedoms that Reynolds and others enjoyed. It was a sobering thought, one that made Reynolds question how much he really understood about the people he was sworn to protect. As the highway stretched out before him, Reynolds decided to make a call. He picked up the radio and contacted dispatch, asking for a brief break from his patrol duties. He needed time to think, to process what had happened, and to figure out how to move forward. The encounter with Carter had shaken him, not because of anything the soldier had done, but because of what it had revealed about Reynolds himself. He needed to reflect, to confront the biases that had been exposed, and to make a plan for how to address them. Reynolds found a quiet spot to pull over, the patrol car's engine idling as he sat in silence. The night was still, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the chirping of crickets. It was a moment of solitude, one that allowed Reynolds to turn inward and examine his own thoughts and feelings. He had always believed that he was a good cop, that he treated everyone fairly, but the truth was more complicated. The encounter with Carter had shown him that he still had work to do, that there were blind spots in his understanding that needed to be addressed. In the stillness of the night, Reynolds made a decision. He would seek out more conversations like the one he had just had with Carter. He would make an effort to understand the people he encountered, to learn their stories, and to see the world through their eyes. It was a small step, but it was one that he knew was necessary if he was going to be the kind of officer and the kind of person he wanted to be. Reynolds wasn't naive. He knew that change wouldn't come overnight, but he was committed to making it happen. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with moments of doubt and difficulty, but Reynolds was determined to face it head-on. He had been given a chance to learn, to grow, and he wasn't going to waste it. The encounter with Carter had been unexpected, but it had been exactly what Reynolds needed. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths, to question his assumptions, and to open his mind to new possibilities. It was a gift, one that he was grateful for, even if it hadn't been easy to accept. As the night wore on, Reynolds started the patrol car once more, the engine's rumble breaking the silence. He pulled back onto the highway, his mind clearer, his resolve stronger. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face it. He would continue to serve his community, but he would do so with a renewed sense of purpose, a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect and serve. Reynolds had learned a valuable lesson that night, one that he would carry with him for the rest of his career. The days that followed the encounter with Carter were a time of reflection for Reynolds. He couldn't shake the impact the soldier had made on him, and it spurred him to take action. Reynolds began to approach his work with a new mindset, one that prioritized understanding over judgment. He made a conscious effort to engage with the people he encountered on the job, to ask questions and listen to their stories. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard. But Reynolds was determined to break down the barriers that had been built up over years of policing. At first, the change was subtle. Reynolds started by asking drivers more about themselves during traffic stops, finding ways to connect beyond the usual exchange of documents. He asked about their jobs, their families, their lives. The responses varied. Some were open and willing to share, while others remained guarded, wary of the uniform he wore. But gradually, Reynolds noticed a difference in the way people responded to him. There was less tension, less fear, and more willingness to engage in conversation. Reynolds also began to seek out opportunities to learn more about the military, driven by his encounter with Carter. He reached out to his nephew, who had recently returned from a deployment, and asked him to share his experiences. They talked for hours, and Reynolds listened intently, absorbing the stories of camaraderie, sacrifice, and the challenges of reintegrating into civilian life. It was an eye-opening experience, one that deepened Reynolds' appreciation for the men and women who served. As Reynolds continued to learn, he started to see the world around him in a new light. The assumptions he had once made without thinking now felt hollow, outdated. He realized that there was so much more to people than what he saw on the surface, and that understanding them required effort, empathy, and a willingness to look beyond his own experiences. It was a humbling realization, but one that filled him with a sense of purpose. Reynolds knew that he couldn't change the world overnight, but he could start with himself. One day while on patrol, Reynolds encountered another soldier. This time it was a young woman in fatigues, her car parked on the side of the road with a flat tire. Reynolds pulled over to offer assistance, and as he helped her change the tire, they struck up a conversation. The soldier, a National Guard member, shared stories of her service, the challenges she faced balancing her military duties with civilian life, and her hopes for the future. Reynolds listened, grateful for the opportunity to connect and learn from her experiences. The conversation reminded Reynolds of the importance of community, of the connections that bind people together despite their differences. He realized that his role as a police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about building trust, fostering understanding, and creating a sense of safety for everyone in the community. The barriers that had once existed between him and the people he served were beginning to crumble, replaced by a growing sense of mutual respect. Reynolds also started attending local community meetings, where he engaged with residents and listened to their concerns. He wanted to be more than just a faceless authority figure. He wanted to be someone people could trust, someone they could turn to in times of need. The meetings were often tense, with people voicing their frustrations with law enforcement, but Reynolds saw them as opportunities to learn and grow. He took their concerns seriously, using them as a guide to improve his own actions and those of his fellow officers. The changes in Reynolds' approach didn't go unnoticed. His colleagues began to see a difference in the way he interacted with the public, and some even started to follow his lead. Reynolds became known for his ability to de-escalate tense situations, to connect with people on a personal level, and to approach each encounter with an open mind. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments of doubt and difficulty, but Reynolds was committed to the path he had chosen. As time went on, Reynolds found that his new approach was not only changing the way he did his job, but it was also changing him as a person. He felt more connected to his community, more aware of the challenges people faced, and more determined to make a positive difference. The encounter with Staff Sergeant Carter had been a turning point, one that had set him on a path of growth and self-improvement. Reynolds knew that he still had much to learn, but he was ready for the journey ahead. Months after the encounter with Carter, Reynolds found himself thinking back to that day. The memory was still vivid in his mind. The soldier's calm demeanor, the realization of his own biases, and the conversation that had changed his perspective. As he reflected on the experience, Reynolds felt a deep sense of gratitude for the lessons he had learned. But there was also a lingering feeling of unfinished business. He had never truly acknowledged the impact Carter had made on him, and that realization weighed on him. Reynolds knew that he needed to take action, to find a way to express his gratitude and make amends for the way he had initially treated Carter. He decided to reach out to the local military base, hoping to track down the staff sergeant. It took some time, but eventually Reynolds was able to get in touch with Carter through a mutual contact. He was nervous, unsure of how Carter would respond, but he knew that this was something he needed to do. The two men arranged to meet at a local coffee shop, a neutral place where they could talk. As Reynolds walked in, he spotted Carter sitting at a table near the window, dressed in civilian clothes but still exuding the same calm, confident presence that Reynolds remembered. Carter looked up as Reynolds approached, a hint of surprise in his eyes, but also a warm smile that put Reynolds at ease. They shook hands, and Reynolds felt a sense of relief wash over him. As they sat down, Reynolds struggled to find the right words. He wasn't used to apologizing, especially not for something that had happened so long ago. But he knew that this was important, that he needed to be honest and sincere. "Sergeant Carter," he began, his voice steady but serious, "I wanted to thank you for meeting with me. I've been thinking a lot about our encounter, and I realize that I owe you an apology." Carter listened intently, his expression neutral but attentive. Reynolds continued, explaining how the encounter had made him reflect on his own biases, how it had changed the way he approached his work, and how much he had learned from that brief interaction. "I'm sorry if I treated you unfairly that day," Reynolds said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. "I jumped to conclusions based on assumptions that I've since realized were wrong, and for that, I apologize." Carter nodded slowly, taking in Reynolds' words. "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," he replied, his tone measured but sincere. "I appreciate your honesty, and I respect the fact that you're willing to confront those biases. It's not easy, but it's necessary." There was a pause as both men considered the significance of the moment. Carter wasn't one to hold grudges, but he understood the importance of acknowledging mistakes and making amends. He could see that Reynolds was sincere, and that meant a lot. The conversation that followed was one of mutual respect and understanding. They talked about the challenges of their respective jobs, the pressures they faced, and the importance of fostering trust and cooperation between law enforcement and the military. Carter shared more about his experiences overseas, the camaraderie he had found among his fellow soldiers, and the difficulties of transitioning back to civilian life. Reynolds listened, grateful for the opportunity to learn from someone he now considered a friend. As they finished their coffee, Reynolds felt a sense of closure. The apology had been important, not just for Carter, but for himself as well. It was a step toward healing, toward building a relationship based on mutual respect and understanding. Reynolds knew that he still had a long way to go, but this conversation had solidified his commitment to continue learning and growing. He was grateful for the chance to make things right, and for the friendship that had emerged from an unlikely encounter. Before they parted ways, Carter offered Reynolds a piece of advice. "Keep doing what you're doing, officer," he said, his voice filled with encouragement. "The world needs more people who are willing to listen, to learn, and to challenge their own assumptions. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." Reynolds nodded, taking the words to heart. He knew that Carter was right, and he was determined to continue on the path he had chosen, one that prioritized understanding, empathy, and fairness. As Reynolds watched Carter walk away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The encounter with Carter had been a turning point in his life, one that had set him on a journey of self-discovery and growth. The apology had been a necessary step, but it was just the beginning. Reynolds knew that he had a responsibility to continue learning, to challenge his own biases, and to serve his community with integrity and compassion. And with Carter's words of encouragement in his mind, he felt ready to take on that challenge. The weeks that followed the meeting with Carter were transformative for Reynolds. The apology had been an important step, but it was the continued reflection and self-examination that truly deepened his understanding. Reynolds found himself approaching his job with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the desire to serve his community with fairness and integrity. He was no longer content with simply enforcing the law. He wanted to build trust, to bridge the gaps that existed between law enforcement and the people they were meant to protect. Reynolds began to seek out more opportunities for connection and learning. He attended workshops on implicit bias, participated in community outreach programs, and engaged in conversations with people from all walks of life. Each experience added a new layer to his understanding, challenging his assumptions and broadening his perspective. Reynolds realized that being a good cop wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the people he served, about seeing them as individuals with unique stories and experiences. One of the most impactful experiences came when Reynolds was invited to speak at a local high school. The event was part of a series aimed at fostering dialogue between law enforcement and the community, and Reynolds was initially hesitant to participate. He wasn't used to public speaking, and he worried about how he would be received. But the memory of his conversations with Carter spurred him on, and he accepted the invitation, determined to share his story and the lessons he had learned. As Reynolds stood before the group of students, he felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. The room was filled with young faces, each one a reminder of the future that lay ahead. Reynolds began by sharing the story of his encounter with Carter, describing how it had opened his eyes to the biases he hadn't even known he held. He spoke candidly about the challenges of being a police officer, the pressures of the job, and the importance of constantly striving to do better. The students listened intently, their expressions ranging from curiosity to empathy. Reynolds could see that his words were resonating, that the story of his journey was making an impact. He talked about the importance of understanding and empathy, about the need to see people as individuals rather than as stereotypes. He encouraged the students to challenge their own assumptions, to seek out opportunities for growth, and to always be willing to listen and learn from others. As the presentation came to a close, Reynolds opened the floor for questions. The students were eager to engage, asking thoughtful questions about his experiences, his views on policing, and how they could make a difference in their own communities. Reynolds was struck by their insight and their passion for justice. It was clear that these young people were eager to create a better world, one where understanding and respect were at the forefront of every interaction. Their enthusiasm was contagious, and Reynolds left the school that day with a renewed sense of hope. The experience at the high school was just one of many that continued to shape Reynolds' journey. He found himself more attuned to the nuances of his job, more aware of the impact his actions could have on others. He made a conscious effort to approach each interaction with an open mind, to see beyond the surface and to understand the person in front of him. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of frustration, still challenges to overcome, but Reynolds was committed to the path he had chosen. Reynolds also noticed a change in the way his colleagues responded to him. Some were curious about his newfound perspective, asking questions and seeking advice. Others were more skeptical, resistant to the idea that they needed to change the way they approached their work. But Reynolds was patient, understanding that change took time and that not everyone would be ready to embrace it. He continued to lead by example, hoping that his actions would speak louder than words. As the weeks turned into months, Reynolds felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. The encounter with Carter had been a catalyst for growth, one that had set him on a path of self-improvement and discovery. He knew that the journey was far from over, but he was grateful for the lessons he had learned along the way. Reynolds was no longer content with simply enforcing the law. He wanted to be a force for positive change, to build bridges and foster understanding in his community. The transformation in Reynolds didn't go unnoticed by the people he served. Community members began to see him in a new light, as someone who was genuinely invested in their well-being. Reynolds received letters of appreciation, invitations to community events, and even a few heartfelt thank yous from people he had previously encountered on the job. It was a testament to the power of empathy, of the difference that could be made when people were treated with respect and understanding. As Reynolds reflected on the journey he had undertaken, he knew that the lessons he had learned would stay with him for the rest of his life. The encounter with Staff Sergeant Carter had been a turning point, one that had set him on a path of growth and self-discovery. Reynolds was committed to continuing that journey, to challenging his own assumptions, and to serving his community with fairness and integrity. He knew that there was still much to learn, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As the months passed, Reynolds found himself reflecting on the changes he had made in his life. The encounter with Carter had been the catalyst, but the journey of self-discovery and growth had been his own. He had come to understand that being a good police officer wasn't just about enforcing the law. It was about building trust, fostering understanding, and seeing each person as an individual with their own unique story. It was a lesson that had changed the way he approached his work, and the impact of those changes was evident in his daily interactions. Reynolds had become more attuned to the people he served, more aware of the challenges they faced and the fears they carried. He had learned to listen, to ask questions, and to engage in conversations that went beyond the surface. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, still times when his old habits threatened to resurface. But Reynolds was committed to the path he had chosen. He knew that change was a constant process, one that required vigilance and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. One of the most significant changes Reynolds noticed was in the way people responded to him. The fear and suspicion that had once colored his interactions with the community were slowly being replaced by trust and respect. People were more willing to engage with him, to share their concerns and seek his help. Reynolds took pride in the fact that he was making a difference, that his efforts to build bridges and foster understanding were paying off. It was a small but meaningful victory, one that gave him a sense of fulfillment and purpose. Reynolds also found that his relationships with his colleagues had evolved. Some of them had followed his lead, adopting a more empathetic approach to their work. Others were still skeptical, resistant to the idea that they needed to change the way they did their jobs. But Reynolds was patient, understanding that change took time and that not everyone would be ready to embrace it. He continued to lead by example, hoping that his actions would inspire others to reflect on their own practices and make positive changes. As Reynolds continued on his journey, he realized that the lessons he had learned from Carter went beyond the job. They had changed the way he saw the world, the way he interacted with others, and the way he understood himself. He had come to recognize the power of empathy, the importance of challenging his own assumptions, and the value of seeing each person as an individual. It was a lesson that had brought him closer to the people he served, and it had made him a better officer, a better colleague, and a better person. The impact of Reynolds' transformation was felt not just in his professional life, but in his personal life as well. He found himself more patient, more understanding, and more willing to listen to the people around him. He reconnected with old friends, reached out to family members he had lost touch with, and even took up new hobbies that allowed him to connect with others in meaningful ways. The changes he had made in his life had brought him a sense of peace and fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. Reynolds also made a point of staying in touch with Carter. The two men had formed a friendship based on mutual respect and understanding, and they continued to meet regularly to catch up and share their experiences. Carter had become a mentor of sorts, offering advice and guidance as Reynolds navigated the challenges of his new approach to policing. Their conversations were a source of inspiration for Reynolds, a reminder of the importance of the journey he was on and the impact it was having on his life. As Reynolds reflected on the changes he had made, he knew that the journey was far from over. There were still challenges to face, still lessons to learn, and still opportunities to grow. But he was committed to the path he had chosen, to continuing the work of building trust, fostering understanding, and serving his community with fairness and integrity. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The encounter with Carter had set him on this path, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Reynolds had come to understand that the most important part of his journey was not the destination, but the process of growth and self-discovery. Each day brought new opportunities to learn, to challenge his own assumptions, and to make a positive difference in the world. He was no longer content with simply enforcing the law. He wanted to be a force for good, to build bridges and foster understanding in his community. And with each passing day, he felt more confident in his ability to do just that. As Reynolds looked to the future, he knew that there would be obstacles to overcome, but he was ready to face them with the same determination and commitment that had brought him this far. He had learned that change was possible, that it was within his power to make a difference, and that the lessons he had learned from Carter would guide him every step of the way. The journey was far from over, but Reynolds was ready to embrace it, knowing that each day brought him closer to becoming the officer and the person he wanted to be. As Reynolds continued to reflect on his journey, he felt a sense of fulfillment that he hadn't experienced in years. The encounter with Carter had been a turning point, one that had set him on a path of self-discovery and growth. He had learned valuable lessons about empathy, understanding, and the importance of challenging his own assumptions. These lessons had not only made him a better police officer, but had also enriched his personal life, bringing him closer to the people around him and helping him build stronger, more meaningful relationships. Reynolds knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, but he was ready to face them with the knowledge and experience he had gained. He was committed to continuing his journey of self-improvement, to being a force for positive change in his community, and to serving the people he had sworn to protect with fairness and integrity. Reynolds understood that change was a constant process, one that required ongoing effort and a willingness to confront difficult truths. But he was ready for the challenge, knowing that each step brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. The impact of Reynolds' transformation was felt not just in his interactions with the community, but also within the police department. His colleagues began to notice the changes in his approach, and some were inspired to follow his lead. Reynolds took on a mentoring role, sharing the lessons he had learned and encouraging others to reflect on their own practices. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was hopeful that his efforts would contribute to a broader cultural shift within the department, one that prioritized empathy, understanding, and respect for all individuals. As Reynolds looked to the future, he saw endless possibilities for growth and improvement. He continued to seek out opportunities to learn, to connect with others, and to make a positive impact in his community. Whether it was through attending community meetings, participating in outreach programs, or simply engaging in meaningful conversations with the people he encountered on the job, Reynolds was committed to making a difference. He knew that the work he was doing mattered, and that each small step forward was a victory in its own right. The friendship that had developed between Reynolds and Carter was a source of strength and inspiration for both men. They continued to meet regularly, sharing their experiences and supporting each other in their respective journeys. For Reynolds, Carter had become a trusted confidant, someone who understood the challenges he faced and who could offer valuable insights and advice. Their conversations were a reminder of the importance of empathy and understanding, and they reinforced Reynolds' commitment to the path he had chosen. As time went on, Reynolds found that his new approach to policing was not only improving his interactions with the community, but was also bringing him a deeper sense of satisfaction and purpose. He was no longer content with simply enforcing the law. He wanted to be a force for good, to build bridges and foster understanding in his community. And with each passing day, he felt more confident in his ability to do just that. The journey had been challenging, but it had also been deeply rewarding, and Reynolds knew that he was on the right path. Reynolds' transformation did not go unnoticed by the people he served. Community members began to see him as more than just a police officer. They saw him as a trusted ally, someone who genuinely cared about their well-being and who was committed to making a positive difference in their lives. Reynolds received letters of appreciation, invitations to community events, and even a few heartfelt thank yous from people he had previously encountered on the job. These gestures of gratitude were a testament to the impact he was having, and they served as a powerful reminder of why he had chosen this path. As Reynolds continued on his journey, he knew that there would be obstacles to overcome, but he was ready to face them with the same determination and commitment that had brought him this far. He had learned that change was possible, that it was within his power to make a difference, and that the lessons he had learned from Carter would guide him every step of the way. The journey was far from over, but Reynolds was ready to embrace it, knowing that each day brought him closer to becoming the officer and the person he wanted to be. In the end, Reynolds understood that the most important part of his journey was not the destination, but the process of growth and self-discovery. Each day brought new opportunities to learn, to challenge his own assumptions, and to make a positive difference in the world. He was no longer content with simply enforcing the law. He wanted to be a force for good, to build bridges and foster understanding in his community. And with each passing day, he felt more confident in his ability to do just that. As Reynolds looked to the future, he knew that there would be challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. He had learned that the road to change was not always easy, but it was always worth it. The encounter with Staff Sergeant Carter had set him on a path of growth and self-discovery, and Reynolds was determined to continue that journey, to keep learning, and to keep making a positive difference in the world. The future was bright, and Reynolds was ready to face it with the knowledge and experience he had gained, confident that he was on the right path.